High in the Sierra Nevada, the land narrows into a series of granite ridges and shallow basins. In late autumn, the air thins and cools quickly after sunset. The elevation rises above 7,000 feet. Pine and fir forests spread across the slopes, interrupted by exposed stone and glacial lakes. Snow arrives early here. It settles without urgency, covering the ground in layers that harden overnight. In 1846, the route over this range was not a paved road but a wagon trail. It crossed what is now known as Donner Pass, a saddle between peaks that channel wind and weather. The trail climbed gradually from the eastern desert and then steepened toward the crest. On clear days, the view extended west toward the Sacramento Valley. In good conditions, a wagon train could cross in a matter of days. By November, conditions changed. Storm systems moved inland from the Pacific and met the cold air of the mountains. Snow fell heavily. Drifts formed along the trail and in the timberline clearings. Streams began to freeze at their edges. The ground beneath the trees turned rigid. The pass did not announce danger. It stood as it had for centuries, quiet and unmoving. The mountains did not alter their shape. They only altered access. For travelers approaching late in the season, the distance to the summit could appear manageable. The descent on the western side was only miles away. The valley beyond lay unseen, lower and warmer. In the spring of 1846, several families left the American Midwest and began the overland journey to California. They traveled in covered wagons pulled by oxen. Most had started in Independence, Missouri, a common departure point for emigrant parties heading west along the Oregon and California trails. Their destination was Mexican Alta California, where land grants and opportunity drew settlers across the continent. Among them were the families of George and Jacob Donner, brothers in their 60s, and James F. Reed, a businessman from Illinois. With them traveled wives, children, hired hands, and unmarried young men seeking work or land. In total, the group that would later be known as the Donner Party numbered in the high 80s, though individuals joined and left along the route. Many were farmers. Some had experience with livestock and long-distance travel. Few had crossed high mountain ranges before. The journey west typically required 4 to 6 months. Emigrant parties moved slowly, averaging 15 miles a day under good conditions. They followed established trails along rivers and plains, repairing wagons, tending animals, and hunting when possible. The route demanded discipline and timing. Travelers were advised to reach the Sierra Nevada before the onset of heavy autumn snow. During the summer of 1846, while moving across present-day Wyoming, members of the Donner Group chose to follow a recently promoted alternate route known as the Hastings Cutoff. Lansford W. Hastings had described this path in letters and a guidebook, claiming it would shorten the journey to California. The cutoff left the main California Trail and crossed the Wasatch Mountains before traversing the Great Salt Lake Desert. The decision to take the Hastings Cutoff was debated among the emigrants. Some parties declined and continued along the established route. The Donner Group proceeded with the cutoff, despite limited first-hand knowledge of the terrain. Hastings himself was not present to guide them through the most difficult sections. The path proved slower and more demanding than described. Wagons required cutting a road through timber in the Wasatch Range. Time was lost. Oxen weakened under strain. Crossing the Great Salt Lake Desert in late summer further delayed the party. The salt flats offered little water and sparse forage for animals. Several oxen died. Equipment deteriorated. By the time the group rejoined the main California Trail near present-day Elko, Nevada, they were weeks behind schedule. The delay reduced their margin for error. Other emigrant parties that had departed later but remained on the primary trail began to pass them. Supplies were consumed at a steady rate. The Sierra Nevada still lay ahead, rising as a final barrier before the Sacramento Valley. By early October, the Donner Party entered the Truckee River corridor, following its course toward the mountains. The air grew cooler. Frost appeared in the mornings. The group divided at times to manage pace and resources. George Donner's family wagon lagged behind due to mechanical issues and the slower movement of older members. As they approached the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada in late October, the emigrants were aware of the season. Snow had not yet closed the pass in most prior years at that time. The distance to the summit seemed measurable. The descent beyond promised lower elevation and relative safety. They did not yet consider themselves trapped. They were delayed, but still moving. The final ascent remained ahead. In the final week of October 1846, the Donner Party began the ascent toward the Sierra crest along the Truckee River. The trail narrowed and rose steadily. Wagons moved in sequence, pulled by oxen weakened from months of travel. Snow had fallen lightly at higher elevations, but the ground was still passable. On October 28, a small advance group attempted to cross the summit. They made progress, but the conditions shifted quickly. Clouds gathered over the peaks, and snowfall began in earnest. Within hours, accumulation deepened across the trail. The snow did not melt between storms. It compacted and froze overnight. The emigrants retreated to lower ground near Truckee Lake, now known as Donner Lake, intending to wait for a break in the weather. Instead, additional storms followed. Snowfall reached several feet in depth. Drifts blocked the path toward the summit and filled the ruts cut by wagon wheels. The oxen could not pull loaded wagons through the accumulation. Attempts to push forward failed. The elevation at the lake stood near 6,000 feet, with the pass above exceeding 7,000 feet. At that height, early winter conditions hardened quickly. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night. Timber became the only accessible resource. Movement beyond short distances required snowshoes, which the emigrants did not initially possess. The party divided into separate camps. Some families established makeshift shelters near the lakeshore using wagon boxes and canvas. Others, including the Donner family, were delayed several miles back at Alder Creek after a wagon axle broke. That smaller group built temporary shelters of brush and hides while attempting repairs. By early November, the trail over the summit was fully obstructed. Snow depth made wagon travel impossible. The animals weakened further as forage disappeared beneath ice. Slaughtering oxen for meat became necessary sooner than intended. Rations were measured more carefully. The moment of delay became a condition of confinement. The route west lay only a few miles away, but it was now impassable. The emigrants understood the geography. They knew that beyond the ridge the descent would lead toward lower valleys. But the mountains held firm. There was no immediate rescue system in place for overland migrants. Communication with settlements required physical travel. With the summit closed, the Donner Party faced a winter at altitude without permanent shelter, limited provisions, and no certainty of outside assistance. The journey had ended short of its destination. The winter had begun. With the trail closed and snow deepening, the emigrants shifted from travel to settlement. Near Truckee Lake, several families dismantled their wagons to construct crude cabins. They used pine logs cut from nearby forest, sealing gaps with mud and cloth where possible. Roofs were formed from wagon covers stretched over poles and weighted with branches. These structures were small and crowded. They were not designed for extended habitation in mountain winter. At Alder Creek, approximately 6 miles east of the lake and slightly lower in elevation, George Donner and his family, along with the families of Jacob Donner and several others, remained separated due to the earlier wagon damage. Their group numbered over 20 individuals. With deep snow preventing reunion with the lake camp, they also began constructing shelters. Timber was available in the surrounding forest, though cutting it required effort in cold conditions. Oxen were already being slaughtered for meat. Hides were used to reinforce roofs and doorways. The camps were isolated from one another by terrain and snowfall. Communication became intermittent. Travel between Alder Creek and Truckee Lake required navigating snowdrifts and frozen undergrowth. As conditions worsened, these journeys became rare. Food management became the central task. At the onset of confinement, some cattle and oxen remained alive. These were gradually slaughtered. Meat was dried when possible, though freezing temperatures preserved it without traditional curing. Portions were allocated to households. Supplies of flour and other dry goods were limited and dwindling. Hunting opportunities were scarce. Wildlife retreated deeper into forest or migrated to lower elevations. The emigrants adapted tools for winter use. Snowshoes were constructed from oxbow wood and rawhide thongs, modeled after designs known from trappers and Native American communities in the region. These allowed limited movement over snow without sinking deeply. Wood gathering required daily labor. Fires burned constantly within cabins to provide minimal warmth. Smoke accumulated inside the small structures, escaping through roof openings. Time was measured less by calendar dates and more by storms and intervals between them. Diaries kept by survivors, including those of Patrick Breen at the lake camp, record snowfall depth increasing steadily through November and December. By midwinter, drifts reached the roofs of cabins. Openings had to be cleared repeatedly to prevent complete burial. Sanitation became difficult. Confined spaces and damp clothing led to illness. Some individuals developed frostbite or respiratory problems. Others weakened from reduced caloric intake. Children were especially vulnerable to cold and malnutrition. At Alder Creek, George Donner injured his hand while cutting wood in November. The wound became infected, likely due to limited medical supplies and exposure to cold. He remained inside the cabin for extended periods thereafter, unable to contribute fully to labor. Leadership became diffuse across the camps. Decisions were made collectively or by those physically capable at the moment. Despite hardship, routines formed. Woodcutting at first light. Meat preparation when available. Clearing snow from roofs. Checking animal remains for usable parts. Families attempted to maintain order among children through simple tasks. The expectation persisted that rescue might arrive in the spring, or that a small group could reach settlements once snow conditions improved. Through November and into December, the Donner Party adjusted to immobility. The cabins stood in silence among buried trees. The mountains did not shift. The snow continued to fall. By December 1846, the remaining livestock had largely been consumed. What began as fresh meat turned to diminishing scraps. Hides were boiled to extract residual fat and protein. Bones were crushed and simmered for broth. Tallow candles were preserved carefully. Flour, where it remained, was rationed in small portions. At Truckee Lake, Patrick Breen's diary notes increasingly sparse meals. Entries mention no meat on several days, and later, nothing but hides. The cabins at the lake held multiple families in confined quarters. Snow pressed against the walls. Windows were minimal or absent. Light entered through door openings when they could be cleared. Fires burned continuously, but wood was not unlimited. Men and older boys cut timber daily, dragging it through snow that reached chest height in some areas. The work consumed calories that were not easily replaced. At Alder Creek, conditions were similar, though slightly lower elevation offered marginal difference in snow depth. The separation between the two camps reduced the possibility of pooling resources. Each group calculated its own survival strategy based on remaining supplies. The understanding grew that no immediate rescue was forthcoming. In mid-December, a plan formed at the lake camp. A small party would attempt to cross the mountains on snowshoes and seek help in California settlements, then still under Mexican governance. The distance westward to Sutter's Fort in the Sacramento Valley was approximately 100 miles. The route required ascending the pass, descending the western slope, and navigating unfamiliar terrain in winter conditions. 17 individuals departed on December 16, 1846. They included men and women from different families. This group later became known as the Forlorn Hope. They carried limited food, small amounts of flour and dried meat. Snowshoes were newly constructed. They moved slowly, often sinking despite the improvised equipment. After several days, supplies ran out. Progress became uncertain in whiteout conditions. Back at the camps, those who remained continued routine tasks. Diaries indicate mounting weakness. Some individuals could no longer rise from bedding without assistance. Children cried for food. Adults responded with measured explanations rather than promises. There was no indication that anyone anticipated the severity the winter would reach, but the physical decline was visible. The forlorn hope faced immediate crisis within days of departure. Snow depth and lack of food led to starvation. Several members died along the route. Survivors resorted to consuming the bodies of those who had perished, a decision recorded in later testimony and survivor accounts. After approximately 33 days in the mountains, 7 of the original 17 reached settlements in early January 1847. News of the stranded emigrants reached California communities. At the Lake and Creek camps, this effort was not immediately known to have succeeded. The cabins remained silent except for routine labor and the sound of wind against packed snow. Time moved slowly. The expectation shifted from short delay to prolonged endurance. The mountains held the emigrants in place. They waited without certainty of outcome. The 7 survivors of the Forlorn Hope arrived in the Sacramento Valley in January 1847. They were emaciated and frostbitten. Their account confirmed that the emigrant party remained trapped in the Sierra Nevada. News spread through settlements near Sutter's Fort. Relief efforts began to organize, though winter conditions delayed departure. In the mountains, January deepened the crisis. At Truckee Lake, the cabins were partially buried. Snow covered entrances entirely at times, requiring tunnels to reach open air. Food supplies were exhausted. Hides that had been boiled repeatedly yielded little nourishment. Starvation advanced in visible stages. Strength declined. Movement slowed. Deaths began to occur within the cabins. The first fatalities were those already weakened by illness or age. Bodies were not immediately buried due to frozen ground and snow depth. Some were placed outside in the cold. Others remained within until removal was possible. The surviving emigrants recorded these events without embellishment. Patrick Breen's diary notes deaths in brief entries, listing dates and names. The question of consuming human remains emerged gradually. Evidence from survivor testimony indicates that, at the lake camp, this occurred after natural death rather than violence. It was treated as a measure of last resort. The decision was not uniform across families, and not all individuals participated. The act was acknowledged later in written accounts and public inquiries. It was not concealed. At Alder Creek, conditions were similar but compounded by isolation. George Donner's infected hand had worsened. He was largely confined indoors. Food supplies there were exhausted earlier than expected. Several members of that camp died before relief arrived. Meanwhile, in the lowlands, the first relief party assembled. In early February 1847, a group of men departed from the Sacramento Valley carrying provisions. Travel through the mountains was slow. Snow remained deep. They reached Truckee Lake on February 19. The relief party found the cabins partially submerged in drifts and occupants severely malnourished. Those capable of travel were selected for immediate evacuation. Children were prioritized. The rescuers could not transport everyone at once due to limited supplies and the difficulty of movement. The weakest remained behind, with promise of additional relief parties to follow. The arrival of assistance did not immediately end suffering. Evacuation required multiple journeys across snowbound terrain. Some individuals died after being moved, unable to recover from prolonged starvation. Others perished before subsequent relief groups could reach them. Winter still held the pass. Survival now depended on measured transport, one group at a time. After the first relief party departed with a small group of survivors, conditions at the camps remained unstable. Those left behind faced continued scarcity. Snow still covered the region in deep layers, and storms returned intermittently through February and March 1847. Additional relief parties departed from the Sacramento Valley as word spread. Each journey required ascending the same frozen slopes that had confined the emigrants months earlier. Supplies were limited by what could be carried on foot. Rescuers found the remaining survivors in advanced stages of starvation. At Alder Creek, George Donner remained alive when the second relief party arrived in early March. His wound had deteriorated significantly. His wife, Tamsen Donner, declined evacuation during one opportunity, reportedly choosing to remain with her husband. George Donner died in mid-March 1847. Tamsen Donner's exact date of death is uncertain, but she did not survive the winter. Accounts differ on the circumstances, and historical records acknowledge gaps in detail. By late March, the final relief party removed the last living emigrants from the mountains. In total, of approximately 87 members associated with the Donner Party, 48 survived and reached California settlements. The remainder perished during the winter. When the snow eventually receded in spring, abandoned cabins and scattered belongings marked the sites of confinement. The trail reopened. The mountains returned to their seasonal cycle. The final evacuations concluded in late March 1847. Survivors were transported gradually to settlements in the Sacramento Valley, including Sutter's Fort. Many required weeks of recovery. Malnutrition had altered their physical condition significantly. Some children were placed temporarily with local families while relatives regained strength. Relief parties returned to the mountain camps in April after snow began to recede. They recovered personal belongings and confirmed the deaths of those who had remained behind. Reports circulated through California and then eastward across the United States. Newspapers published summaries drawn from survivor testimony. The pass that had confined the emigrants reopened as temperatures rose. Wagon travel resumed along the same route later that year. The physical evidence of the winter remained visible for a time before being absorbed by weather and movement. The journey west continued for others. By spring of 1847, the Donner Party's ordeal had ended. Survivors carried forward the memory of confinement, loss, and endurance. The cabins and wagons had vanished under snow and time. The Sierra Nevada resumed its cycles, indifferent to human passage. The events remained a testament to the hazards of high-altitude travel in winter, the limits of preparation, and the human capacity to endure prolonged isolation under extreme conditions. Silence returned to the pass.